Welcome to the final module of the Adolescent Literacy Virtual Foundations Training. You've worked your way through what is content literacy, academic dialogue, writing to learn, and vocabulary development. Now it's time to think about how we pull all of these together to support instruction in the classroom to strengthen student learning. The planning document. So if you go to the web page and you go to the planning tab, it'll bring you to this page. Scroll down. Here's the video you're watching. Here's the double entry organizer. Here's the minimum daily learning sequence, or MDLS document. And here's that MDLS framework applied to the learning sequences that you use as part of this training. A double entry organizer is designed to give you some prompts, things that we want you to think about as you're watching the video. But more importantly, it's not what we say here, but it's the connections you're making to what you already know, your content, and what you know about instruction in your content. The next is that minimum daily learning sequence. We'll come back to that in just a second. And then last but certainly not least, we'll look at one of these minimum daily learning sequences through the lens of how did we choose the strategies and design the instruction to meet that MDLS. The minimum daily learning sequence is a compilation of what we've found about research and our own experiences in supporting teachers in planning for integration of the adolescent literacy model in the classroom practice. It starts with a coherent learning experience using literacy purposefully to support clear learning objectives. So those three big chunks, coherent experience, purposeful literacy, and clear learning objectives, become the foundation that we build instruction in our classroom. That coherent experience is a combination of strong understanding of content so that we're hitting the higher depth DOK standards, not just the lower level standards. So we need to know our content well, but equally as important to understanding the content is how do we help students process that information, especially as we ask them to think at higher levels. They need steps and processes to be able to do that effectively. And so we want to make sure that that coherent experience fits together for instruction in the classroom. The other part of that is literacy is purposeful. We're not choosing the strategy first, but we're thinking about the purpose before we choose the strategy. I don't say, oh, I want to do the word wall. I think I want to make sure that my students can use the vocabulary of my content effectively, and that they are getting the opportunity to really make the connections between what we're doing in the classroom, what they understand, and how they express what they know about the content. And the strategy that makes sense to me to do that is the interactive word wall. That's why you would choose the word wall. Not because everybody says, oh, we have to have a word wall. There should be a purpose behind why we're using any of the strategies that we choose. And then the last, but certainly not least, really is what gets us started, is a clear learning objective. We want to make sure that we know the purpose for the learning so that that helps guide the strategies that we choose as part of the instruction. So the minimum daily learning sequence has four components to it. We want to make sure that we activate the lesson, we access prior knowledge, we engage the student, we hook the student. If you look at research into rigor, it is very clear that without engagement, you can't get to rigor. So that activate the lesson is a key component of that. Getting the students thinking about what they already know, getting them engaged in the lesson successfully. The second component is this idea of how are we going to access this information? How are we going to process this new information? It's not necessary that I am now an expert once I've heard the lecture, read the text, or watched the video, but it's that I am able to interact with the content, make connections to what I already know, and there's a purpose for why I'm doing it, so that I'm ready for that next step. It's not just, oh, we're going to read this text, but we're going to read this text so that we can set ourselves up for a discussion later. So that means as I'm reading this text, I want to make sure that I'm taking notes, citing evidence, making connections to what we've already been talking about, noting those so that when we are having that conversation, I'm able to help other people find the information that I'm talking about in whatever reading or component we have. Again, we're going to access information, and I've been set up to be successful after we've done that. And then we apply and process that information. Again, as I'm new learner, as I'm learning something, I begin to get a lot of connections to things, but I've got to organize my thinking. I've got to process that information. I've got to make sure I understand how it connects to my tests and what I already know. So it's important that we give students and participants the opportunity to process. And we can process multiple ways. We can read about it, we can write about it, we can talk about it and listen about it. But each one of those uses a different component of the brain. So we want to make sure that we're giving participants and students a balanced approach to literacy. So we use whole brain instruction. And then last but certainly not least, we want to help the students process and synthesize what they're learning to help deepen that understanding and make it easier for that retention of knowledge moving forward. Also, when we're synthesizing learning, we're synthesizing process as well as content. That coherent experience means we want to think about both as we move forward. And that helps me as a teacher when I'm getting feedback from my students about what was most successful and what they're struggling with still as far as process goes, know how much more scaffolding or differentiation of instruction I need to do moving forward. There in this document that you see, there's that third column about possible strategies. This is not a complete, compelling list of strategies. It's some that are part of the adolescent literacy model, but it's not necessarily all of the strategies that are in your toolbox or in your department's toolbox or in your school's toolbox. Again, remember the power of the adolescent literacy model is that we use strategies that generalize across multiple classrooms. So maybe I've got a toolbox of strategies that nobody else in our building has. It doesn't mean that I don't use them or that they're not good strategies, but we also want to think about what my role in supporting student learning is in the classroom. And so thinking about how we use common language helps students generalize processes across classrooms, as well as supporting students in understanding how these strategies apply to my content. So for instance, if we're thinking about a See, Think, Wonder as a reading strategy, as a reading comprehension strategy, that See, Think, Wonder is going to be very similar in all my content areas. But when I'm reading in lab experiment data in a science classroom, I'm going to be reading that data differently than I'm going to be reading data from the 1960s in social studies. In social studies, I'm looking at the data, but I also want to think about context. It's really important to think about in social studies that we triangulate that information with multiple sources. In that experimental situation in the science classroom, it's more about, I know what the situation is because I helped design that and have input in that, and I understand that, but I'm processing it now from the perspective of the science classroom. So that See, Think, Wonder generalizes across multiple classrooms, but there are slight differences in how it's applied in each one of those settings. And it's important that we think about how we support students in being successful in using these strategies in my classroom. That last column is really just to help drive home this idea of a balanced approach to literacy. Again, as we think about writing being different than academic dialogue, being different even than listening skills, we want to make sure we're getting a balanced approach so that we're activating more opportunity for the students to make connections. Okay, this would be a great time for you to take a pause, go back to your double entry organizer, make some connections to what you listened to and in your double entry organizer, and fill in some connections to what you already know. Okay, we're back from our pause. Now we're going to jump over here to a learning sequence, and I'm not going to read you all the way through it, but I want you to think about, for instance, in this content literacy module, that we chose processes and strategies very purposefully. So for instance, when we had you access information needed for that initial reading out of your Foundations guidebook, we gave you the text codes and margin notes strategy. We didn't give you that strategy randomly. We did it very intentionally. In fact, if you remember, one of the codes that we gave you was T for terms, and we were getting you already priming you to think about what were some of those key terms. But we wanted you to read that content, not look for terms only. And so there were other codes. This connects, and this is important. I have questions about this. Having you add some margin notes for the discussion and helping you round out that conversation. But those codes were chosen because it helped us with this next component, how we were going to help you process the information. What were those 5 key terms from the reading? And then you use those in a list, group, and label to organize them into patterns. A lot of times when we do this, people kind of use that Venn diagram model of student actions, teacher actions, and then things that fit into both of those. It's really important to think about the fact that that's a lot about what we're looking for in instruction. What is the teacher doing? What is the student doing? And how we enable the students to do more in processing information. So that was one of the purposes behind choosing that specific strategy. Could have used a different strategy, something like a double entry organizer or an anticipation guide, but we were setting ourselves up for that next apply and process information. So it made sense for that flow. And then last but certainly not least, our closure was a quick write. And the strategy of quick write is a very simple one. It's a writing to learn strategy that has you process information. So why and how is content literacy important to student success in my classroom? You'll notice that is tied into our learning objective. We want to go back and get feedback from you about how we did with our learning objective, helping you synthesize that information. It is important to note that we would have, and we normally couple that writing, quick write with an academic dialogue to get participants talking with each other. But because we were in an asynchronous virtual module, we weren't necessarily able to do that. So that was missing from that part of the synthesis. So this hopefully will give you a little bit of understanding around the MDLS and how we choose strategies to fit purpose as we move forward and to set ourselves and our participants up for success. So if you have any questions, make sure that you're noting them in your double entry organizer and bringing that to the next component where you're going to do a little analysis of your own thinking.